and welcome to Short Stories, a production of the National Taichung University of Science and Technology Language Center. This semester I am following a theme, and the theme is opera. You will hear 16 short stories, all based on Western operas that are public domain, of course. The first opera that I have converted into a short story is Carmen. It was composed in French by Georges Bizet. I'm from Missouri, so I am definitely pronouncing that wrong. It premiered on March 3rd, 1875. The plot of this opera was inspired by a short story of the same name. So, you will hear a short story version of an operatic version of another short story. Do you follow? The title character of this story is a gypsy woman. Gypsies, most of whom actually prefer to be called Roma, are an ethnic group that can be found in countries across Europe, and since the 20th century, the world. No one is quite sure where they came from, but the earliest records of them in Europe date back to 1322 AD. But because they speak their own language and live in small, tight-knit communities, Roma have often been the subject of both suspicion and fascination for centuries. Vocabulary. Accoutrements. Accoutrements. We packed all the necessary accoutrements for our camping trip. Contraband. Contraband. The Border Patrol agents searched the band's car for contraband. Crimson. Crimson. Baron von Richthofen flew a crimson plane. Flirtatious. Flirtatious. Jill dumped Jim after discovering flirtatious emails that he had sent to another woman. Goody Two-Shoes. Goody Two-Shoes. The criminal was captured thanks to the help of a few Goody Two-Shoes teenagers and their dog. Ne'er-do-well. Ne'er-do-well. You should avoid going to places that attract ne'er-do-wells. Paramour. Paramour. Jim often took his paramour to a romantic restaurant. Seductive. Seductive. The mermaid used her seductive appearance to lure men into the ocean, where they drowned. In Seville, Spain, there was a cigarette factory on the east side of the town square. On the west side was the entrance to a bridge over a canal. The elegantly decorated College of Mariners sat on the south side of the square, opposite the headquarters of the Regional Civil Guard. It was here that Corporal Morales and his comrade were idly chatting and watching the daily hustle and bustle. Suddenly, someone in the crowd caught the corporal's attention. "Excuse me," said a lovely young woman named Michaela, "but I'm looking for Private Don Jose. Do you know where I can find him?" Morales smiled, displaying his tobacco-stained teeth, and replied, "His shift starts in an hour. Why don't you wait here with us, pretty lady?" Michaela shyly refused and responded, "No, thank you. I'll come back later." Morales and his comrade silently watched Michaela disappear into the crowd before they continued their idle conversation. About 50 minutes later, Don Jose and his commanding officer, Lieutenant Zuniga, arrived. After saluting each other, Morales and his comrade gave way to the new guards. "You lucky dogs," groaned Morales. "You get to watch as the cigarette girls come out of the factory for their break." Zuniga smiled and said, "It's one of the perks of being a lieutenant. I get to decide the shift schedule." After Morales entered the guardhouse, Zuniga turned to Jose and said, "You'll like being on this shift. The cigarette girls are really quite a sight." Jose blushed and responded, "If you say so, sir." Zuniga grinned and said, "Oh yeah, that's right. You already have a girl, don't you? That Michaela girl, isn't it?" Jose blushed even harder as Zuniga playfully punched his shoulder. A few minutes later, a whistle inside the cigarette factory wailed, and the doors of the factory opened, allowing the female workers to spill out into the square. Zuniga and Jose watched as they seductively smoked their cigarettes and exchanged flirtatious comments with the young men who were in the square. But there was one woman who was more seductive and flirtatious than all the rest combined. Carmen. Carmen was a dark-haired gypsy woman of about 20 years of age. An impetuous young man approached her and asked, "When will you marry me, sweetheart?" Carmen raised one eyebrow when she looked at him and replied, "Maybe never." Another young man handed her a flower and asked the same question. She responded with a sly smile, "Maybe tomorrow, but certainly not today." Stopping in the middle of the square, she performed a half-spin, causing her skirt to flail and display a flash of its crimson hue. "Love is like a rebellious bird," she sang to her audience of admirers. "It cannot be captured so easily." After completing her song, the audience cheered. But as Carmen surveyed her admirers, she couldn't help but notice that one person in the crowd was not cheering: Jose. She threw the flower to him and smiled. Jose bent down and picked it up, not sure about what to say or what facial expression to make. Zuniga slapped him on the back and yelled, "You really are a lucky dog." Suddenly, the factory whistle wailed once more, signaling the return to work. Carmen and the other cigarette girls drifted back inside, and the crowd dispersed. All the while, Jose kept staring at the flower in his hand. About a minute later, Michaela returned and declared, "There you are." Jose, suddenly falling out of his trance, looked at Michaela and said, "You were looking for me?" Michaela skipped toward him and replied, "Yes, silly. I have something for you." She handed him a letter from his mother. Jose smiled as he skimmed his mother's handwriting, remembering his childhood days in the countryside. He and Michaela were neighbors, and they had often played together. Now that he lived in the city, he found himself missing her company. "And she said to give you this," whispered Michaela as she leaned in close to give him a peck on the cheek. Jose's entire face turned as red as a tomato. "What's that?" asked Michaela, pointing at the flower in Jose's hand. "Oh, this? I found it on the ground," he replied. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Jose bid Michaela farewell. But his thoughts remained twisted throughout the day. He loved Michaela, his childhood sweetheart, but he couldn't stop thinking about Carmen. "I need to get that witch out of my head," he thought to himself. "When I go on leave this summer, I'm going to marry Michaela." Not long after Michaela's visit, the peace and tranquility of the square was interrupted by a violent commotion from inside the factory. A tangle of women burst out of the door, wrestling and pulling one another. Zuniga ran over and separated the combatants. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The other women all pointed at Carmen and shouted, "She did it! She stabbed Manuelita!" Zuniga immediately seized Carmen and handed her over to Jose. "Watch her while I investigate," Zuniga commanded. Jose saluted and slapped a pair of handcuffs on Carmen. Jose tried to question her about the incident, but Carmen just turned her head and sang "Tra-la-la." Zuniga soon returned after questioning the other girls and ordered Jose to escort Carmen to jail. "You can do your singing from behind bars," growled Zuniga. As soon as they were out of sight from Zuniga, Carmen whispered to Jose, "You won't put me in jail." Jose, incredulous, replied, "What makes you think that?" Carmen smiled wryly and responded, "Because you love me." Jose stopped dead in his tracks, looked directly at Carmen, and announced, "I love Michaela, not you." Carmen scoffed and said, Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself?" Then Carmen went on to explain that the flower she had given him was enchanted, and that he was now under her spell. "Let me go, and I will meet you at the Habanera Inn next Friday evening." Jose was stunned, not so much at Carmen's request, but at his own willingness to consider it. "I've always been a rebellious bird," admitted Carmen, "but I think you might be the one to finally capture my heart." How could Jose resist? He suddenly found himself unlocking Carmen's handcuffs and letting her go free. Lieutenant Zuniga, as you can imagine, was mightily upset at Jose's dereliction of duty. He ordered Jose to be jailed for 1 week as punishment. On the outskirts of Seville is the infamous Habanera Inn, which attracts a wide range of ne'er-do-wells from across the region. The first floor of the inn contains a bar operated by a surly wench named Lilas Pastia. On this busy Friday evening, the house band was playing music while 2 young women, Mercedes and Frasquita, were dancing for the entertainment of the male guests. Zuniga, Morales, and a few other guardsmen were there, laughing loudly and drinking copiously. The 2 women were close friends of Carmen, who had decided to remain backstage to avoid being seen. After the dance was over, the 2 girls engaged the soldiers in coquettish conversation, hoping to get some extra tips. Through conversation, the girls learned that Jose was free. However, he did not accompany his comrades to the inn. When Carmen heard this news, she became excited. "He'll be here. Just wait," she assured her friends. Not long after Zuniga and the other soldiers had left, loud cheers could be heard coming from the streets outside. Who could that be? Wondered Carmen as she came out of her hiding place to get a better look. Into the inn strode the handsomest man in all of Seville, which is the same as saying the handsomest man in all the world. "3 cheers for Escamillo, the greatest matador in all of Spain," someone in the crowd bellowed. Everyone in the bar raised their glasses and shouted, "Hip, hip, hooray," 3 times. Escamillo raised his right hand to signal to his audience of admirers that they should settle down. "Thank you all for your warm welcome," he said as he swaggered to the center of the room. "As you know, today was the day of the bullfights. Would you like me to tell you about my greatest triumph?" The crowd roared, "Tell us, tell us!" And so Escamillo began singing about his courageous exploits in the arena. After his song was sung, he couldn't help but notice that one young woman wasn't gazing at him in breathless amazement. Carmen. He boldly approached her, removed his hat, and bowed as he kissed her hand. "May I have permission to know your name?" he asked. Carmen pretended to yawn and replied, "What will you give me in return?" Escamillo, who was both shocked and intrigued by her lack of interest, answered, "The heart of Spain's bravest bullfighter." Carmen tilted her head and said, "Is that all?" The 2 then engaged in flirtatious banter for some time, but in the end Carmen refused to go home with him. "I have pledged my heart to a guardsman," she explained. "I love a challenge," grinned Escamillo before walking out the door. "We shall meet again." After the crowd had staggered off to their beds, Carmen attended a meeting with her friends and business partners. This included 2 men, Danker and Remendado, who were professional smugglers. They were discussing a shipment of contraband they were planning to sneak across the border. Mercedes, noticing how distracted Carmen was the whole time, asked her, "Are you in?" Carmen shrugged and said, "I can't. I'm waiting for Jose." Mercedes and Frasquita couldn't believe their ears. "What?" they exclaimed. "You can't be serious." Carmen insisted that she was, and as luck would have it, in walked the man himself. Speak of the devil, muttered Raymondado. Your boy's a guardsman. We could use a man on the inside. Carmen gave him an evil stare and whispered, Don't you even think about bringing him into this. Carmen ran to embrace Jose, who wasn't sure what to do. I almost didn't come, he admitted, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. Carmen smiled at him and told him everything that had happened after she had escaped. Jose was glad she was safe, but he didn't like that she was dancing for money. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of a bugle in the distance. I need to return to the barracks before the next bugle call, said Jose. Don't go, begged Carmen, but Jose shook his head and repeated the motto of the Civil Guard. Honor is my badge. I must do my duty. Carmen grabbed his arm and pleaded, If you really loved me, you'd run away with me to live a life of liberty in the mountains. Jose then handed her the flower that she had given him and sang a lovely song. Just as Jose was about to leave, who should show up but Lieutenant Zuniga? Private Jose! He exclaimed. Upon recognizing Carmen, Zuniga's expression turned sour, and he said, We let you out too early, Jose. You are both under arrest. The two guardsmen scuffled with one another. In the melee, Jose lost control of his temper and struck Zuniga hard on the head, knocking him out cold. What have I done? Shouted Jose as he pulled his hair. You can't stay here. Quick, come with me, said Carmen as she pulled him by the arm. The two ran off together into the dark and uncertain night. The following night, to his bewilderment, Jose found himself in the smugglers' encampment, hidden in the hills not far from Seville. The 5 other members of the group, Carmen, Mercedes, Frasquita, Danker, and Raymondado, were all preparing for that evening's mission. I'll go check to see if the coast is clear, announced Danker before he left the security of the camp. While he was away, the women began chatting and playing with their tarot cards. Looking over at Jose, Carmen noticed how dejected he looked. Don't be such a downer, she said. After tonight's job, we'll have enough money to buy a cabin in the woods. Jose did not answer. Don't you want to know what your future holds? Carmen asked, while waving a tarot card in front of his face. My future holds nothing, muttered Jose. Carmen frowned and quipped, No one forced you to be here. This statement made Jose mad, and he exclaimed, I had it all before I met you. Carmen was a bit taken aback by this. You didn't have me, she said before turning to her friends to continue her card game. Place your card, Carmen, begged Mercedes. Let's see what you got. All 3 women stopped breathing for a couple of seconds when they saw Carmen's card, the death card. Before the girls had time to discuss the meaning of this card, Danker returned and announced the beginning of the mission. The plan was for the women to distract the customs officers while the smugglers drove their cartload of contraband across the border. You stay here and guard the camp, said Danker, pointing his cigarette-stained finger at Jose. Jose glumly nodded his head to show his consent. Sitting alone in the dark, Jose began to grow anxious. He jumped when he heard a noise. Who's there? He shouted, pulling out his pistol. Relax, amigo, replied a deep, masculine voice. It is I, Escamillo. Jose lowered his pistol and asked, What are you doing here? Escamillo explained that Carmen had invited him to help carry her portion of the contraband. The two began chatting amicably around the campfire. How did you meet Carmen? Jose finally asked. Escamillo then described their meeting at the Habanera Inn. I have never felt such passion for a woman before, he declared. But she said that she had already given her heart to a goody two-shoes guardsman. There was a moment of silence as the 2 men put 2 and 2 together and realized that they were romantic rivals. You can't have her, growled Jose. She's all I've got left. Escamillo jumped to his feet and challenged Jose to a fight. You think you can take me? he bellowed, and the two men locked arms and began wrestling each other. Somehow, Jose managed to get a hold of his pistol and pointed it right at the bullfighter's chest. Escamillo would have died that night if it weren't for the intervention of Carmen. "Stop it, you two!" she yelled. Dancaire and Remendado then seized Jose by both arms and dragged him away from Escamillo. "My love!" exclaimed the bullfighter. "You have saved me. I owe you my life." Carmen allowed him to kiss her hand before she turned her attention to Jose. "What's gotten into you?" she scolded. "You have," answered Jose. "You're making me crazy." Carmen said nothing and turned to leave with Escamillo. The following day Jose learned through a friend in the civil guard that Michaela was looking for him. He arranged to meet her at a secluded spot where she told him some terrible news. "Your mother is sick," she announced. "You need to come home." Jose was devastated by this news. "Of course I'll come," he finally said after a few seconds of distraught silence. The two left Seville together, but as soon as he passed the city gate, Jose turned back to look at the town and declared in his own heart, "I'll come back for you." A week later, another round of bullfights was held at the Seville Arena. This round was even grander than the last, as it was the last round of bullfights for the season. The bullfighters paraded toward the arena, each wearing his finest accoutrements. At the end of the parade was Escamillo, with Carmen at his side. The couple waved to the crowd. "Sorry, ladies," announced Escamillo, hugging Carmen, "but this bull is no longer on the market." He gave his paramour a kiss before he ran into the arena to prepare for the first bullfight. Just then, Mercedes and Frasquita ran up to Carmen. "Watch out," they warned. "We saw Jose in the crowd, and he had a terrible look in his eyes." Carmen waved her hand dismissively and replied, "Please, I know how to handle angry men. Escamillo isn't the only bullfighter." She then turned to enter the arena. On her way to her seat in the arena, Carmen was stopped in a narrow passageway by Jose. "I'm not afraid of you," she told him, "so if you've come to threaten me, it won't work." Jose fell to one knee and said, "I'm not here to threaten, I'm here to beg." He then pleaded with her to run away with him. Carmen crossed her arms and refused. Jose stood up and began begging more forcefully. Nothing he said swayed her. Finally, and in great exasperation, he said, "You can't tell me that you actually love that oafish Escamillo." Carmen looked Jose in the eyes and said, "I love Escamillo, and you are just going to have to get used to it." Jose suddenly became more agitated. He paced back and forth, breathing heavily. "I'll do anything you ask," he pleaded. Carmen responded by taking the flower from her vest pocket and throwing it on the ground. "Leave me alone," she asserted. Watching Carmen discard the flower, the symbol of their love, on the ground with such contempt, was more than Jose could take. In a fit of rage, he pulled out his knife and stabbed Carmen in her side. As she lay on the ground, bleeding to death, Jose fell to his knees and begged her to live. "What have I done?" he lamented as he ripped his own clothes in anguish. Jose did not try to hide what he did. He made a full confession to Lieutenant Zuniga at the guardhouse. He was sentenced to death the next day. "You'll be shot like the dog that you are," growled Zuniga. After the execution, Morales and the other guardsmen smoked cigarettes outside the guardhouse, waiting for the factory whistle to blow. Now the questions. Number 1. Where did Jose first meet Carmen? A. Near the cigarette factory. B. At the Habanera Inn. C. At the smuggler's camp. D. At college. The answer is A. Near the cigarette factory. Question 2. What was Escamillo's job? A. Matador, B. Paramour, C. Smuggler, D. Guardsman. The answer is A. Matador, also known as a bullfighter. Question 3. Why did Jose and Escamillo fight? A. They were criminal rivals. B. They were romantic rivals. C. They were pursuing the same bull. D. They were competing in the arena. The answer is B. They were romantic rivals. Question 4. Who killed Carmen? A. Escamillo, B. Mercedes, C. Frasquita, D. Jose. The answer is D. Jose.